So the Galway Environmental Network started in 2 years ago, and the idea was that we'd bring the networks or the environmental groups and people interested in the environment in general together, and to widen it out to businesses, community organisations, and to raise awareness of what needs to be done for the environment in Galway City and the county. And we've had some very, very good events and dialogue over those last 2 years. And unfortunately, COVID kind of stumped us a bit this year. So as everybody was getting used to dealing with Zoom and COVID and all that kind of stuff, we kind of took a step back just for a bit, just to kind of let people get used to dealing with COVID and also get used to learning how we can actually run events again. So this is our first event since COVID. So hopefully it'll go all right tonight and everyone can get on okay. Is that we're here to talk about the climate action and low carbon bill, and what we're trying to understand and get through to people is what is the bill about, how is it going to affect their lives, and because so many people think the bill is more to do with the money, but it's not really the actions. We're looking for how to explain how the bill needs to be enacted really, and really try and get that point to people, because people just look at the bill as carbon charges, how it's going to affect them monetary. But there's much more to it than that, I think. So Sadhbh O'Neill is with the Friends of the Irish Environment and also part of the Stop Climate Chaos. And you can give an overview of yourself, Sadhbh, as well as the work you're doing on the climate bill.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
And thanks for coming.
Not at all. You can all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a real honour, and I'm so delighted to see so many environmental activists turning out on a Monday evening in November. It's really encouraging to see so many people engaging with what in the past would have been a really dry, cerebral sort of aspect of environmental policy or climate policy. And it's wonderful to see so many people engaging around this, because this bill is very important. Now, I'll just introduce myself quickly to say that while I was involved with the Climate Case and Friends of the Irish Environment up until last Christmas, since then I've started working for a coalition, Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, and we are Ireland's largest civil society coalition, representing a broad range of faith groups, youth groups, international development, environmental organisations, big ones, small ones, and tiny ones even. So the reason I was asking earlier about the Galway Environmental Network is I'm going to suggest that you consider joining our coalition, because we'd love to have more networks like yourselves, because of your ability to reach out again into the communities and into smaller groups, smaller local environmental groups. So we have been working on climate governance issues for a long time. My colleague Oisín Coughlin started campaigning for a climate law back in 2007. So this issue has been rumbling on for a long time in Irish environmental and climate policy. And it has an interesting history, which I won't go into now, but suffice to say that it took another 7 years before a bill was finally enacted into law in 2015. That's known as the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. And this is the act that we are now talking about amending. So I have a few slides to show you, and hopefully that will put the kind of whole discussion of this bill into a kind of context, and I'll highlight some of the strengths and weaknesses, and then maybe the other two members will be able to discuss what's happening at a political level in the committee and so on. So I'll just share my screen now to show you what slides I have. Hopefully that is easy to see.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's me, and my email address is there if anybody wants to contact us afterwards. So just to say, what the Climate Action Act that was adopted in 2015 was very important. It was the first time in Irish law that set a policy objective for climate action. And obviously when you're talking about climate change, you're really talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and you need to be able to express your target in a quantitative way. Unfortunately, the Act didn't actually set a quantitative target for emission reductions, But it did set a broad transition objective whereby we would be aiming to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from the main sort of fossil fuel polluting sectors by 80% by 2050. And the other thing is it gave clear obligations to the minister to devise a national mitigation plan and a national adaptation plan. Now, that national mitigation plan that was adopted in 2017 was the plan that was subject to the Friends of the Irish Environment legal challenge in the courts that was finally successful in July. So that plan was adopted in 2017, and it was controversial at the time because the minister at the time adopted the plan without having really taken the advice of the Climate Change Advisory Council. So this council was also established under the 2015 Act, and it's, if you like, an expert advisory body, because if you're talking about, greenhouse gas emissions from a variety of sources and sectors, you need to have a scientific basis for both measuring that and also for analysing what the appropriate efforts should be from each sector. So that's where the Climate Change Advisory Council comes in. That was established in 2015 with Professor John Fitzgerald as chair. And it had quite a lot of economists in its membership at the beginning, I suppose reflecting a concern post-financial crisis that whatever Ireland did to reduce greenhouse gas emissions needed to be done in a cost-effective way. The Act also set out a reporting mechanism between the Minister and the Oireachtas, whereby not just the Minister for Climate Action, but all the ministers that had sectoral responsibilities over greenhouse gas emitting sectors would have to make an annual transition statement to the Oireachtas. But in practice, this proved to be really quite symbolic and not very meaningful, because there wasn't ever any Dáil debate. The ministers would come in, read a statement, and then leave again. And it was something of a frustration for many members that they couldn't engage and critique the policies and the actions of the government in a robust way, and in a way that held the government to account properly for delivering on the measures set out in the plan and the overall effort towards reaching the national transition objective. So the law was an improvement in terms of it was better than nothing, but it had very significant weaknesses. So roll on to lots of things happened in the meantime. I should say we had a citizens' assembly. We had the publication of the IPCC 1.5 report in 2018, the emergence of the school strikers, and a kind of explosion of activism and interest in communities all over the world. And a huge spike in media coverage, which was very important in kind of, I suppose, driving home the message that this is not a problem we can afford to just keep kicking down the road. Urgent action is required. So in the lead up to the election, and then obviously, if you recall, we had the election in January, and then there was a long period of negotiations between the different potential coalition parties. And finally, in July, the government that was formed adopted a programme for government which committed to a 7% per annum reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And a part of it was a commitment to introduce a new climate action bill to set that target in law, alongside a new revamped or somewhat upgraded Climate Action Council or Climate Change Advisory Council. And critically, the bill was to introduce 5-year carbon budgets, which were modelled, if you like, on the UK Act, which was adopted back in 2008, and which is rightly regarded as a kind of gold standard for how you do climate governance. So the reason why, setting the targets in law and setting up a proper expert advisory body, clearly defined ministerial duties and accountability mechanisms, and then the carbon budgeting process. These are all elements, if you like, that have to work together in order to signal to the wider economy that this emission reductions thing is really happening. And this is what different sectors of the economy need to do. All ministerial functions need to be, if you like, in line with that target. So you can't be saying, I'm responsible for introducing a 7% emission reduction in my area, whatever that is, let's say in road transport or in housing, but at the same time be implementing policies that actually lead to higher emissions. So the idea is to get a kind of coherence across government, proper coordination, so that each little bit of effort in each department is signaling to the outside economy, to all the private actors, to householders, to consumers, but also cross-government coordination, which was a piece that was somewhat missing under the 2015 Act. And it was particularly absent in the case of, say, the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector had been somewhat sidelined in the 2015 Act because of a national policy position that was adopted that wasn't referred to explicitly in the 2015 legislation, but it essentially created a kind of get out clause for agriculture where it didn't have any targets at all. And secondly, the emissions from that sector increased during that period. So between 2015 and 2020, we've seen emissions from agricultural practices, mostly intensification in the dairy sector, lead to rising greenhouse gas emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. So you have a situation where like the law plays a really important role in driving clear policies that deliver emission reductions. And without that legal basis, you can't really expect anyone to be held to account. So roll on to September, when was it, October, 100 days after the formation of the government, as promised, Minister Eamon Ryan published the Climate Action Amendment Bill. And I'll just run through a few key features of the draft bill just to highlight what's in it, and then maybe I'll offer a few criticisms and let the others come in after that. So the first thing is, as promised, the bill proposes to set a quantitative target. So the national 2050 climate objective is going to be net zero emissions. And the reason it's net is to allow for the fact that you have a bit of flux between the sort of land use potentially releasing emissions and also capturing emissions or sequestering or storing them in reclaimed and restored bogs or in forestry. So you don't ever really expect to have zero emissions from land use, because if there's any agricultural practices at all, there's bound to be some emissions released, but they can be balanced if it's done correctly and very ambitiously by other land use activities in a sustainable fashion. So the bill does propose to make the climate neutral economy a legally binding target of government, an objective of the government by 2050. There is some criticism of the language here in that the state is pursuing it but not achieving it. Now, mind you, you don't want to discover in 2051 that you failed to meet the target, because that would be too late. So the question is how we write the language into the bill so that it clearly drives the emission reductions from the get-go, and that we're not just postponing action way down the line. Because it's almost impossible to reverse mistakes. The level of mitigation that we are going to be required to do is so ambitious, we can't afford to be missing targets anymore. That has been a feature of Irish climate policy to date that has only left us with rising bills, rising emissions, and serious problems that will be very expensive to fix. We definitely see elements in the bill where the climate governance part is much better. We have sort of a strengthened Climate Change Advisory Council, broader range of disciplines that will be reflected. For Stop Climate Chaos, it was always important to us not to see stakeholders represented on the council. It's not about setting up the IFA and IBEC and the likes of ourselves. It's about actually using this body to generate expert advice across a range of very technical areas or interdisciplinary issues that can be quite difficult to tease out. Having said that, they're an advisory body, and the political process must be clearly set out as well in terms of how the politics responds to that expert advice. I actually think that's a good part of the drafting of this bill, is the mechanism by which the carbon budgets will actually be considered by the Oireachtas and adopted ultimately by the government. So there's a much stronger role there for the Oireachtas than in previous versions of the bill. It's still not a fully independent body, but it is definitely an improvement on what we had before. And the bill sets out a new process whereby the climate action plan that was published under Richard Bruton when he was the Minister for Climate Action is going to become an annual plan that will be updated year by year. And there will also be a longer term climate action strategy that's aiming, more long term to achieving the 2050 target. And as part of that, then you have the carbon budgets established in law, 3 at a time. The first 2 much more pinned down, and a little bit more flexibility around the third. And the idea is to adopt these well in advance, again, clearly signaling to each part of the economy the emission reductions that will be required. Now, my colleague Oisin Coughlin is always urging us to try to find an alternative phrase other than carbon budget to capture this, because it always sounds like it's something to do with money, when in fact it's really just a number. It's emissions, usually expressed in millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's about amounts of gases that we release into the atmosphere, and it doesn't signal anything directly about cost. So you can think of it as an emissions envelope or an emissions budget, if that makes it easier to understand. The important thing for us is to ensure that the carbon budgets are clearly covering all gases in all sectors, so that there isn't any kind of loopholes or opportunities for some sectors to say, oh, well, we're not covered by that. We do our own thing over here and we're not covered it. Everything needs to be in the carbon budget, because ultimately, if you're talking about climate action, it's a physical process. You can't just be turning a blind eye to the greenhouse gases that are inconvenient to do anything about. You have to deal with all of them. And that includes emissions from aviation and shipping, from consumption practices as opposed to our territorial emissions, the emissions we import as a result of the products and trade that we engage in as an economy. And it also includes any carbon credits that we might choose to purchase from abroad. So we have to be thinking about the whole impact of the Irish economy on the atmosphere. And that is challenging, but it is possible to write those things into the bill. Legislation in the UK and in Scotland does that very, very clearly, and there's no reason why we can't have the same here in Ireland. So again, I mentioned agriculture, just because of the way the politics of agriculture works in Ireland and its very important role in driving up greenhouse gas emissions, because it's about 1/3 of our overall emissions, which is very high in comparison to other European countries. So there was a commitment in the programme for government to recognise the special role of agriculture. And in addition to that, the bill recognises the distinct characteristics of biogenic methane, but this is a rather peculiar reference because in fact, it doesn't say anything like that in the IPCC report of 1.5 degrees. So this is an area that we have some concerns about. We would not want to make sure that the carbon budget definition includes all gases and that any reference to the IPCC report needs to be correct. And similarly, we can't be devising new metrics or ways of understanding the role of methane that somehow dodge the reality that annual emission reductions are going to be required from every sector. They may be less stringently required of agriculture than other sectors because methane is a more potent but a short-lived greenhouse gas. So we could afford to perhaps have emission reductions of say 3 or 4% from methane per annum and 7 or 8% from carbon dioxide, and that would all add up to the effort that is required if we are to comply with the Paris Agreement. The bill also includes provision for sectoral targets, and these are called decarbonisation target range. There's been some criticism of this language and that why have a range? The numbers all have to add up ultimately to the carbon budget. So, you know, creating this kind of flexibility is a bit meaningless. But importantly, it will be the Minister for Climate Action that devises the sectoral budget, the decarbonisation range for each other department. So you can imagine there will be quite a lot of behind the scenes negotiation and lobbying, and it'll be important that this process is made more transparent. The bill does establish obligations on the Minister, but the way it's been written in this bill has been subject to quite a lot of criticism. It's written in a rather vague way. I'll let the others address some of those points. And, you know, just looking at the legislation that was adopted in Scotland, there's so many clear examples of language we could have usefully just copied and pasted into our bill. It's very, very clear in the Scotland Act that the ministers must ensure that the target is met. But for some reason, there's a lot of resistance amongst the drafters and the Attorney General's office to incorporating language that's explicit. I think there's a fear of litigation, and ultimately that means that the Irish law is weak and vague in ways that it really needn't be. Finally, the Scotland Act refers to a just transition, and in fact this is just one section of it. There's another detailed section as well, and it contains much more useful way of thinking about how to incorporate the principles of a just transition into the different budgeting processes that are done, either the sectoral budgets or the overall carbon budget. So this covers kind of three areas. I suppose it covers the climate justice piece as well. So when we think about what we're obliged to do as a country and what we must have regard to when we're drawing up plans, policies and budgets, we need to be thinking about our role in the international arena as a developed country and our special obligations to support less developed countries by taking on a bigger share of the effort and by assisting them with finance and other forms of aid. But basically recognizing that our historical contribution as developed countries is much higher than that of developing countries. Our emissions per capita, our capabilities as an economy, our resources and so on enable us to do more. So there's an international climate justice piece, and then there's the impact of policies on particular sectors or geographical regions that are very vulnerable to rapid economic change. And the board Namona workers are the classic example there. And thirdly, there's the sort of social justice element, the impact of higher fuel prices on people who are already marginalized or on lower incomes or happen to be living in older housing that is of less quality. So I realize I'm going on a little bit here, but so I just wanted to finish by saying that there are lots of good things in the bill, but there's still a lot of tweaking and improvements needed to bring it up to scratch. It's very welcoming that the committee has seen so many fantastic experts coming in, giving very coherent analysis that loosely point in the same direction. So I think that the report of the committee, when it's concluded, will definitely be pushing the government to deliver an even better draft bill before it's published properly in the Oireachtas and brought to committee stage. So we look forward to seeing what that will be, and obviously we will assist the members in any way we can along the way. So I'll just stop there.
That's great, Sadhbh. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll keep the questions till we've had all our speakers. So we'll move on to Hildegarde Naughton.
Thanks.
And Hildegarde is the Minister for International Transport and Logistics. So if you'd like to carry on there, Hildegarde, thanks.
Thank you, Caroline, and I really welcome the invite here this evening to talk on about this bill that is currently going through the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Climate Action. And just to first of all say that this is not under my remit. I'm in the Department of Transport, as Caroline has said, but I did chair the Climate Action Committee that Sadhbh mentioned there, and that was a fantastic overview actually, Sadhbh, of I suppose our journey to date in relation to where we're at. So I suppose I had a particular interest over the last couple of years, and I'm not directly involved. It's Eamon Ryan, it's his area, but I'm delighted just to, I suppose, represent government here today. And so I just have a few words here, and I'll start, and then I'll let Alice Mary in after. So just to say, the programme for government sets out how we will respond and manage the challenge of decarbonising our economy and creating a sustainable future for everyone. So we have a responsibility to future generations, as we know, and the incredible youth climate movement, as Sadhbh referred to there, demanded real change, and for government to take responsibility and to own this challenge. So in recognition of the current climate and biodiversity emergency, this bill was placed as a priority legislation on the government agenda for this term. The Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Bill reflects an evolution in our thinking on climate over a number of years and has been informed by many inputs. What that tells us and what's required is an enhanced governance framework to enable this transition and clear long-term objectives. Recommendations from the 2018 Citizens Assembly report and the 2019 Joint Oireachtas Climate Committee report are very evident in this bill and provided the turning point to ensure that legislation provides a clear obligation on this and future governments to develop and implement meaningful climate policy. The bill builds on the existing 2015 Act and provides for a significantly strengthened statutory framework for governance of the climate challenge. This will ensure continual and credible long-term planning for the realisation of Ireland's 2050 climate neutral objective. The depth and the scale of the change required to address this climate challenge is significant and undisputed. That is why the programme for government commits to 7% emission reductions per annum from 2021 to 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. The bill will facilitate the delivery of this commitment. Evidence of the warming of our climate system is clear. Research already tells us that Ireland's climate is changing and will result in higher temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and increases in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. These changes are expected to continue and intensify into the future. The transition to decarbonise is both an urgent challenge and an opportunity to build a better future for all. Ireland needs to choose to play a leading role consistent with our EU and our international partners. The prevailing economic perspective on climate action is that the longer it's delayed, the more costly it will become. Forward-looking policies to address how these changes will impact relevant sectors is necessary. Reducing emissions and scaling up adaptation measures will ensure Ireland remains sustainable, competitive, and climate resilient. The Climate Bill will embed in our institutions the long-term planning framework to make the transformative change required. It will ensure Ireland becomes a leader, not a laggard, when it comes to climate action. We're setting a new direction for our country, and climate action provides us with opportunities to reimagine our economy and society. Embracing the transition will support further job creation through the development of new emerging sectors. The green economy, including the retrofitting and renewable energy sector, the circular economy, clean mobility, green and blue infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, and the bioeconomy will create high-quality employment opportunities that will be a source of significant employment growth over the coming decades, as well as supporting a stable tax base. Inaction and failure to rapidly move to a carbon-neutral economic model will have far-reaching negative impacts on the economy and the public finances, undermine the long-term sustainable competitiveness of the economy, and lock Ireland into a redundant fossil fuel-based economic model. By enacting these commitments in legislation, it sends a clear signal to the economy, to businesses, farmers, and to our communities that climate action will drive investment to allow us both to reach our climate targets and to stimulate job creation. We can already see investment decisions are being made on this basis. The bill will enact a 2050 target for committing to climate neutrality. This means achieving a balance of exceeding emissions and removals of greenhouse gases by 2050 and in subsequent years. This approach is in line with the ambition set out in the EU climate law proposal, and it's consistent with the objective of the Paris Agreement. It will introduce a system of 5-year carbon budgets, including decarbonisation target ranges for every relevant sector. It will strengthen the role of the Climate Change Advisory Council, who will propose appropriate carbon budgets to government. It also requires that the Council are consulted if, under limited circumstances, there is a need to revise an adopted carbon budget. Budgets will be approved by government with strong input from the Oireachtas. This process to develop and adopt carbon budgets goes beyond what we know as a whole of government in the traditional sense and involves a particularly inclusive approach of both houses of the Oireachtas. It's a novel approach, but the transformative change required to address the climate crisis requires new ways of doing things in every sense. And this includes a consensus approach to carbon budgeting if it is to really work. The bill provides a suitable balance of flexibility and long-term stability to support necessary investment and implementation over time. Carbon budgets will provide a ceiling of total greenhouse emissions allowed within a 5-year period, calculated on an economy-wide basis. It also provides that sectoral targets will be adopted under the ceiling of each 5-year budget, providing further sense and clarity on the obligations required across all relevant sectors. While the bill will provide certainty on our long-term climate goal, a level of flexibility within these statutory structures is important, which will allow, where necessary, a degree of adjustment and reorientation of carbon budgets, plans and strategies over time and within different sectors. The increased scale and depth of our climate ambition is consistent with the approach being discussed at EU level. Both domestically and at EU level, it's recognised that we are not yet in a position to identify all the emerging technologies, the changing scientific consensus, or policies to meet our full ambition. However, committed research in the area and the continued intensive updating of mitigation measures over the decade and beyond will ensure that we remain on course to achieve our climate ambition. To this end, the bill replaces the former process of developing a series of successive national mitigation plans by introducing a requirement to annually revise the Climate Action Plan and also prepare at least once every 10 years a national long-term climate action strategy. The Climate Action Plan will be aligned to the adopted 3 5-year carbon budgets. It will set out the actions and the measures to achieve each 5-year budget and associated sectoral targets assigned. Annual revisions to the Climate Action Plan addresses the need for intensive and regular monitoring and updating of policy actions to ensure that we remain on track and within our emissions limits. The National Long-Term Climate Action Strategy will look then at long-term pathways to achieve the long-term objective beyond the short to medium-term period provided in the Climate Action Plan. The bill also provides a greater level of oversight and accountability to the Oireachtas, with all relevant ministers to give account of their progress for their areas annually. Through regular reporting of progress and a shared responsibility of the task ahead, Ireland will deliver the change required, realise our long-term climate objective and achieve our EU and international climate obligations. The bill will also require local authorities to prepare individual climate action plans, which will include both mitigation and adaptation measures every 5 years. This requirement ensures climate action is taken on at every appropriate level, national, regional, and embedded in the community. And in this spirit, the NORA legislation is also being amended as part of the bill. This will ensure that more climate projects, nature-based and community-led projects, can apply for support from the Climate Action Fund. In terms of the level of investment required to meet our increased climate ambition and likely increased EU targets, the proposed review of the National Development Plan will provide further opportunity to ensure sufficient economic analysis underpins the necessary changes in resource allocations required to meet Ireland's climate targets. To ensure that Ireland is at the cutting edge of scientific and technological innovation in meeting our climate targets, the programme for government also commits to introducing a transformational programme of research and development. For 2020, the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications provided €12.5 million to the EPA and the SEAI to undertake research and development activities in the field of climate, energy and low carbon. Research funding is also provided to the Geological Survey Ireland for this area, which is an increased budget of €1.65 million in 2020. Science tells us that this is what is required. The legislation will provide a starting point to enable the change, but it will require many other measures through consultative policy development, carbon budgets, and supportive fiscal budgetary measures through public and private investment. And finally, Ireland already has legally binding 2020 and 2030 EU climate and energy targets. Soon there will also be an EU 2050 target. Ireland must take responsibility and become an active participant in addressing the climate challenge. This can be achieved by doing what is required, what science tells us, achieving net zero emissions over the 30-year period to 2050. To manage temperature balance, this bill is the starting point to realise this objective and the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Hildegarde. We'll move on to Senator Alice Mary Higgins, and you're on the Climate Committee, aren't you? Yeah, you're mute there, Alice Mary. Thanks very much. We can hear you now.
So I am on the Climate Committee, and I joined actually the Climate Committee in the final year of the previous Oireachtas. So I would have overlapped for a year as well with Hildegarde in terms of the committee at that point. So I have maybe a position where I can see some of what we were doing in the last committee, and indeed the very different new job at hand in this committee. And then maybe just to give a personal sense, I would have been very active in terms of climate justice issues since about 2007 or 2008. And I would have gone to the Copenhagen International Climate Talks of 2008. And then in a civil society, I was working with Trócaire at the time. And then with a very different hat, I was at the talks in Madrid last year. So I've kind of, a lot of, I would say, the urgency that I would see in it has been for the fact that I've seen 10 years in which not enough has happened. And I've seen 10 years in which there's been a very positive rhetoric and still a failure to act. And that's why I think it's so vital that we get a really, really robust piece of legislation that is going to do the work that we need. In regard to the legislation, sorry, I think I'm just going to slightly raise my screen here so that I can be seen to everybody. In regards to the legislation, I think probably the best is if I went through some of the areas I can believe it can be strengthened. I mean, first of all, of course, it's really, really good that we're getting new legislation, that it would be second generation legislation, because that's where we are across the world now. We're in a place where lots of different countries have had a first go of legislation around climate action, and they're now into the space of second generation, or in some places third generation, which is almost how can we learn from what's happened in the past and have stronger legislation that's going to do the work. And it's good that new legislation is being looked at, and I think we've had a really, really constructive cross-party discussion with really excellent testimonials and expertise over the last few weeks. The areas where I believe the bill needs to be strengthened are in relation to, first of all, firmer language. I'm going to come back on a number of places where the language needs to be firmer, but the very obvious one is it's simply not, it would in fact be a step backwards if we go from a previous commitment to achieve net zero down to, which was in the draft previously, to simply a language which says pursue net zero. I mean, achieve net zero is, from my mind, the absolute basic. And then there is that question around the level of ambition. So a lot of countries are planning to reach net zero quite a ways ahead of 2050. For example, in Scotland, the target they've set themselves is 2045. And another really crucial thing in the Scottish legislation, and it's been very useful for us to look to comparative second generation legislation in different countries, and this is something that has come across from multiple speakers to the committee, is that 2050 is too far away in terms of the only hard target in this bill being 2050. I, for one, will be 75, and I don't want to be just expressing disappointment then that we didn't reach it. People want to have a hard target, and I think there needs to be a very firm target in terms of 2030 and possibly many others. So there's a debate. Do we need multiple, what we call minimum interim targets, or do we have, but at an absolute base point, I think there's a very strong consensus that we need to have something in there for 2030 so that we know by 2030 if we're on track. The thing with the 2050 is it gives a lot of wriggle room in every 5-year budget to say, well, by the time we get further down the road, things will have improved. Whereas if we have a very hard and firm primary legislation 2030 target in the bill, that means that in 2030, we're really able to say if this has been working and if these structures have been working. And again, I think there's a couple of points around that, because it's something we've heard about, the 7% commitment that is in the programme for government. But I would suggest, and I think a lot of those who've testified to the committee suggest, that it's not good enough that we would be reliant or even dependent on what might or might not happen to be in a programme for government. Because we know that governments change, that ministers change. And it was really interesting, one of the speakers, I think it might have been Colin Reid from the UK, but I'm not 100% sure, maybe John Church, spoke about the example in the UK where in fact you had a minister who was quite hostile to climate action who sought to unravel the bill, who sought to unravel the action and the plans. And that's why one of the real powers that you have if you want to guide policy or implement policy as a government is by introducing strong legislation and embedding real targets into primary legislation. And that's why I think it is going to be crucial that there would be a minimum interim target. And the reason I say minimum is, of course, we don't want this to set the limit because the science is changing, and the science is changing to increase our ambition all the time. So that the interim target should be a minimum interim target. And again, there's useful guidance from Scotland, because in Scotland, they have set their ambition. I think it is, they were aiming for 56% by 2020, 75% reduction by 2030, and 90% reduction by 2040. But what's really interesting as well in the Scottish Act, and this is something I think Sadhbh mentioned, there's good language in the Scottish Act that we could and should borrow. They have what they call a ratchet clause, which says the ambition can only be changed upwards. That we can't have a scenario whereby in the future, with whatever dynamics might be in any political scenario in the future, that this bill allows a minister to roll down the ambition level. The ratchet clause means it has to increase. And again, that's also what the science is telling us. And it's very notable that, you know, in terms of most scenario plannings, required us to already have peaked in 2020 if we wanted to stay below 1.5 degrees. We are actually almost definitely in this, heading towards the space in between 1.5 and 2 degrees at the moment. And that's a huge concern, because that really is already having catastrophic impacts for people around the world. So again, that idea of the interim targets, the firming of, and then there's a question around what they should be. So going from the Programme for Government Commitment, that would get us kind of 7% year on year and would end up at about 51%. We know that the European Commission has committed 55% at the moment. Pushed for the European Parliament have recently voted for 60% by 2030 as their interim target. We have people who've talked about 70%, and a very compelling case was made by an eminent expert, Professor Kevin Anderson, in the very last session that we heard, for 80%. Now, so that question of where the interim target should be for 2030 is a further point for debate. And I think that's something that we will have to battle. But the key point is that it must be ambitious and it must be a minimum interim target. In terms of comparable legislation, again, we've been looking at the UK legislation, which was a gold standard, as I've mentioned, but I think now almost the new Scottish legislation has become even more of a gold standard. And we're also seeing good second generation legislation in the Netherlands, New Zealand, which is interesting in how it's tackled some issues which overlap with us. Another section then, coming back to that question, and I'm going to come into the question of accountability in a minute, because that's why one of the reasons having a hard targets in the bill and in primary legislation, which allow anybody to challenge, in fact, their achievement, is very important. But just to come into then the question of the carbon budgets, I don't believe there is a conflict between having hard interim targets and having a carbon budget process. The Scottish legislation has both. But there is a problem, there is an interesting, it's kind of section 3 of the Act. It has a very long list of factors. It actually goes A to Y, kind of amazingly. They leave themselves this wriggle room of just said, so A to Y, of a whole set of factors which the ministers should have regard to. Now, have regard to is very woolly language, and the fact of there being 26 things, widely different things, which should be had regard to, leaves us in a really, really ambiguous space in terms of language. It's been pointed out by some that it's very dangerous in terms of litigation, because anybody could choose to take one case that one point wasn't balanced properly against another point in that regard. It invites litigation from all sides, and it also creates a kind of an ambiguous mulch. And some of those factors are simply not the same as each other. So one thing that's been really clear from a lot of the people who've spoken to us is that certain of these factors are more important than others and need to be recognized as such in the language, and the language needs to be really clear on that. And that the main one that is getting a strong emphasis from everybody is basically factor A, which is that ultimate objective from the Article 2 of the UNFCCC in New York in May 1992, and that is, you know, the reduction in temperature. And then also the mitigation or adaptation commitments that are entered into by the European Union. Again, we know that they are looking at 55 to 60% at the moment. And then the steps specified in Article 2 of the agreement in Paris around achieving that. Now, I would strongly argue that Article 2 and Article 4 of Paris are both important. So there's a concern there that Article 2, you know, there's a little bit of picking and choosing some elements of the Paris Agreement. Article 4 is really important. It goes back to that increasing, because it's literally the highest possible ambition. And it goes back to that idea of we need to be moving forward all the time, and we need to commit to moving forward all the time on this. We need to protect and future-proof ourselves against any backsliding. So those are the factors that are kind of really crucial, because that's ultimately our game, our aim, and that's where we need to be having really strong language. And there's been different suggestions. Should it be consistent with, compliant with, such as will achieve? You know, there's different opinions on what exact language needs to be used. But the key point is, those are factors that need to be placed very centrally. Then there's another tier of factors, things like, for example, climate justice, the question of the measurements, of course, right, that factor and the measurement of emissions are crucial. Then there is a little bit of a question again around certain other factors. Climate justice is really important. One thing that's really concerning, and again, this is around the 2030 target, is the Sustainable Development Goals aren't actually in this plan. They aren't referenced at all, which is really surprising, given that they are very much twinned with Paris in terms of that Agenda 2030. So we would argue, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals, things where Ireland has made a commitment already, that they need to be something that is given a serious consideration and a serious weighting. That's maybe that second tier, if you know what I mean. And then there's a wider set of factors which may be had regard to is the appropriate language, as well as some factors which are really concerning. And I think some of us are certainly, some of the witnesses, and I would say myself and some others in the committee, have expressed concern around their inclusion at all. These are things like a reference to value for money, a strange reference to value for money, which references value for money as being central, and then says benefit, you know, public benefit as far as practicable. Now, that's something that we feel could be a very dangerous get out clause, and a clause for very bad policies plowing ahead. Questions around cost effective and what's meant by that. You know, is that around price quality? Is that life cycle costing, for example, where we're looking at the cost of everything over its life? You know, what is meant by cost effective? Because that's a phrase that could mean anything from lowest cost right through to a very deep analysis of social and economic costs. So there's a lot of different phrases in the area of have regard to, which need to be teased out a little bit more, or in some cases maybe removed. Another area where there's some concern is the phrase carbon leakage. I don't know what everybody who's listening thinks when they hear carbon leakage, but it's one of those, it's a phrase which we might discuss it later. I know Sadhbh will understand and be able to, but we've heard multiple interpretations of what it may or may not mean. And actually, the danger is it's around business moving to different countries in response to environmental regulation. So there's a real danger that becomes an excuse not to act. You know what I mean? If it, depending on how it's interpreted. So one thing that we've heard, I think, really positive suggestions, it is around exactly, I think Sadhbh mentioned this, non-territorial emissions, something that will capture that idea of non-territorial emissions, the emissions that are happening elsewhere. For example, if we are importing a product which has had a very, very high cost in terms of production, but there's also the flip side where we are producing things and the damage is being done elsewhere. So there's the question of how non-territorial emissions are recognized, and maybe the idea again of how we account for life cycle emissions. That's something that's really important. And just to mention, it would have been even more important if Trump had won in the elections recently, because we would have been in a scenario where we had a very, very large actor which wasn't even counting the damage it was doing. So, you know, anyway, that's a whole area to be looked at. There's lots more. What's missing in the things that need to be had regard to? Biodiversity. And biodiversity features in a couple of places in this bill. There is reference to nature-based solutions. It's referenced into the kinds of projects that might be funded by the Climate Action Fund, but there isn't a really robust discussion of biodiversity, not simply as solutions and nature-based solution, but biodiversity as having a value and as something that we have to really consider when we're making our plans and when we plan policy. Just transition and climate justice, and I might come back to those in a moment. Maybe if you could let me know when I have 5 minutes left, because I don't want to use up all your time. So let me know when I'm in my last 2 or 3 minutes, and but I will come back to those in a minute. But the other thing that maybe needs a little bit of looking at is all of those different factors. Some of them are really relevant for deciding the carbon budget. Like some of them are really relevant for figuring out how many tons of emission we can produce safely while, you know, not contributing overly to the overheating of the planet and all the catastrophes. So some of them are very relevant to that factor. That's what I would call almost the how much, the budget question, the how many emissions, the how much. Some of those factors are actually a little bit more relevant to the how. So not to the how much, not what our limit of emissions needs to be year on year, but the how in terms of what are the best ways to achieve that. They're almost like two different pieces of work. One really is, in the end, scientific, and it is around, you know, what the space is. It's scientific with and also a little element when we come to climate justice of our global responsibility. And maybe on climate justice, I would just say, again, something that's already in the climate agreement and in the UNFCCC, which needs to be in this bill and referenced and remembered, is the common but differentiated responsibility with respective capacities. And that is, you know, when we talk about, there's no definition of climate justice in the bill at the moment, but one key thing is that fact, which I think Sadhbh spoke about as well, that Ireland has a greater responsibility, developed countries have a greater responsibility, and that means that we also have a greater capacity, and that needs to be part of our factoring. So if you think of those are the factors around the how much, and then in terms of the how, that's where some of the balancing, like the questions of agriculture, the questions of biodiversity in particular, for example, which is making sure we come up with climate plans that actually stand up to environmental impact assessment and that are consistent with the Habitats and Birds directives, as well as driving us forward in terms of carbon reduction. You know, that's the kind of good forestry policies versus poor forestry policy, you know, that space around a joined up thinking. So that's kind of that space of the how we do it. And that's where sectoral plans come in. And I think it was mentioned, I said, the sectoral plans I think are really interesting. The decarbonisation range is potentially going to be it will be subject to a lot of lobbying, but it could potentially also these could become kind of robust tools. And that brings me to the Advisory Council. And there is a question, there's a very wide set of expertises that are being looked for in the Advisory Council. Some of those expertises are going to be more suited to that work of the how, you know, what kind of plans we come up with, what sectoral plans might need to be, you know, that work. And then some of them are going to be that really hard expertise around the how much we need to reduce this year to stay on track. What I think Professor John Sweeney called the glide path, to make sure that we're still on path where we can still achieve what we need to achieve. And it is interesting, there was a few debates, I won't go into great depth in the advisory committee, I'm happy to come back on it. Some of the debates are whether the ex officio members, that's members who are members of public bodies who are on the board, and like they're bringing a really important expertise, of course, should they be voting members or not? That's a debate that's happening at the committee. The question of a youth representative is being discussed by the committee. The question of international expertise and how that comes in. And that question of balance, which is while there's a wider list of expertises that can be drawn on, there isn't a guarantee that all those expertises will actually end up being in the room. And that's a little bit of a concern, because we did have too many economists in the previous Advisory Council. And it was very striking, I thought, Professor John Fitzgerald, and who's of course an absolute expert in his area. But when he spoke to this committee recently, he said how in 100 years the economics hasn't changed. But what we know is that the climate has changed. So we are in a position where the economics needs to change. And I think we aren't going to be able to get where we need to go if we try to fit climate action into the exact old model of economics that we've had for 100 years. And I know I'm
Alice,
I'm out of time.
We're out of time, yeah. We need to
perfect.
get a few questions
can I
in, but
just say, I let the question in. Perfect. And that's fine. Maybe just a last question to everybody, which is, should offsetting our technological solutions, our carbon capture be allowed when we calculate net zero? Because that's a concern as well. And there's some other issues, but I'm happy to leave them aside. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to ask a question myself to the three of you, and then we'll come to some of the other questions. And it was something that I was reading in the reports and the newspapers. And the first question was, the Minister for Climate Action and the government are not obliged to rationalise or provide evidence for their decisions and their subsequent impacts. With this, we always need to have transparency and accountability. And I think that's a really vital bit of information. Like, this is something that we strive for in this country, is transparency and accountability. And sometimes we find it very hard to get that accountability, through various departments. So if you could perhaps answer that question, maybe we'll move to Sadhbh, Hildegarde and Alice. And just a quick reply. Niall? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if speakers could keep it very quick.
Yeah.
In this, there's a lot of very good questions from the audience, and we want to get through as many of them as possible. So please keep it very quick.
Well, I can answer this one quite quickly. There's the bill is peppered with references to, in my opinion, and this has been highlighted by almost all the members as a clear weakness and an attempt to avoid any litigation. So those phrases need to be taken out. But yeah, I mean, there's no need for that. And there are other elements in the bill that would hold the minister to account and would make it very difficult for the minister to succeed in any legal challenge. So, in my opinion, doesn't really help the minister. It's not a get out of jail free card, and the language needs to be much more clear in making the minister both obligated and then accountable.
Okay, thank you. Hildegarde?
Hi, Caroline. I think it's your question in relation to the accountability, is it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. I suppose that's where the oversight and the governance oversight that is really fundamental to this bill, and that is a real, I think, a fundamental shift in the way we deal with climate policy. The fact that you've got the Oireachtas oversight, the Oireachtas committee that can hold ministers to account, bring them in every year. There will be quarterly reports as well in relation, it'll be led by the Taoiseach's office. There'll be quarterly reports cross-sectoral within government in relation to how reaching their targets. You have the Climate Change Advisory Council, which will be beefed up and have better expertise, and they'll be better resourced, and they will be outlining the carbon budgets, and it will be up to the minister of the day and the government of the day to come before the Oireachtas to explain and to set out why they are accepting the carbon budgets or not. And there is really clear lines of transparency. And I think that was something that Sadhbh mentioned at the beginning, the lack of that accountability. And that is, I think, the big win. And I know when we launched the Climate Action Plan as a committee in 2018, that it was much lauded internationally. And this bill is very much reflective of that. So I think we have come an awful long way. I think there's huge accountability. And that's the big, it's probably the more boring part for people, the governance structure, but it clearly sets out the targets, the timelines, and there is accountability within the Oireachtas.
Yeah, thanks very much. I still think the language within the bill needs to be a bit stronger on that myself, but we'll move on to Alice.
Yeah, so through the committee process, it's going through the pre-leg at the moment, but just as
I know I think it absolutely needs to be strengthened. It's not clear ultimately if things aren't achieved. Is it this minister? Is it the previous? Who's ultimately accountable? There isn't any clear structure in terms of sanctions or consequences. There is, in terms of, as an Oireachtas member, simply being able to express disagreement or disappointment isn't I get to do that all the time, and it's very unsatisfying. And I think it is around that there needs to be really robust actual consequences if either particular ministers, particular departments, or the overall minister again, and the country fails to meet. And that's where things like that hard interim target are really important, and there needs to be much clearer sanctions. At the moment, the ministers in preparing their own sectoral, local, their particular departmental targets are not obliged to show that they're trying to achieve the 1.5 or that they are indeed within the carbon budget. So there really needs to be much stronger accountability joined up at the moment. I worry that we will get people blaming the minister before them or the minister after them, or passing the buck to the minister after them as it currently stands.
And there will
thank you.
be sanctions as well, remember that. And ultimately we all lose out if we don't reach our targets. There's consequences for sure. There's sanctions, but yeah.
Niall, do you want to take a question there from the chat?
Sure. What I'm doing is grouping the questions. So there's first of all 2 for Sadhbh, and then we've got 3 questions on carbon tax for the 2 politicians. So we'll be fairly democratic about it.
Go for it then.
For Sadhbh, anyway, the question submitted by Louise Vance, who's the co-chair of Plastic Free Kinvara. She's asked, in our work at Plastic Free Kinvara since 2018, we have raised public awareness of the single-use plastics crisis collecting in landfills and in our seas. What provisions can be included in this climate bill to address single-use plastic packaging, specifically requiring manufacturers and suppliers to replace non-degradable petroleum-based packaging with sustainable packaging? And a second question comes from Vincent Carraher, who said that a climate neutral target of the bill allows for land and emission flux therein, but can Sadhbh comment on those of us who believe it's so we can purchase emissions reduction from poorer countries instead of ramping up positive structural change in Ireland? It also allows for carbon storage technology adoption, and this again is not as positive a technological change as, say, renewables or energy efficiency retrofits. So carbon neutral terminology can allow actions which are not all that positive relative to lasting and sustainable changes to our energy infrastructure. So it's one question on single-use plastics and the second one on other countries. So we'll give those to Sadhbh.
Okay, great. Well, the first one is kind of straightforward in relation to plastic, in that there isn't any provision in the bill to deal with single-use plastic. However, I wouldn't think that that's surprising, because this piece of legislation, if you like, is around climate governance, and it's setting in place the structures for target setting, expert advice, carbon budgeting and reporting and so on to the Oireachtas. And in the bill, it does set out in a very primitive, very basic way, how we report on our emissions. Now, to a certain extent, these are covered under the Kyoto Protocol guidelines and the various international kind of protocols that are in place around reporting of emissions. But this is perhaps where the issue of plastics needs to come in. And it doesn't just cover plastics, it also covers any kind of embodied emissions in economic activity, whether we import it or whether corporations that are active in Ireland are manufacturing stuff that has a lot of embodied energy or will generate lock-in or generate future emissions. So even though this is not, strictly speaking, the answer to the question is no, there isn't any reference to plastic. But down the line, I imagine that maybe in the 3rd generation legislation, we're going to see things like corporate responsibility and monitoring and reporting. We're going to see a lot more emphasis on non-territorial emissions and offshore mitigation. And this is where the plastics comes in, because just like the fossil fuels that they're made from, plastics are this kind of ubiquitous, mobile raw material that is creating just mountains and mountains of problems. Now, I would have thought that the easiest way to address that would be through the Waste Management Act and the packaging regulations. And there is power, the minister it's actually the same minister, Eamon Ryan, has the power under those pieces of legislation to take much bolder action on plastics. I understand that the recent initiative on circular economy does go some distance towards that, but it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise on. So we can't put everything we want into this bill. That's the answer. We really have to be looking at the right place to stick in those kind of regulatory initiatives. But down the line, yes, a lot more corporate accountability.
So the second question.
Yeah. I took a note of that one actually, and it's a complex one. So yes, as it's written, the bill defines net zero in a very loose way. It doesn't set out which emissions might be sequestered and which emissions might be made magically disappear with some fancy new technology that hasn't been invented yet. Which emissions and which types of land use sequestration might be subject to more stringent biodiversity assessment, and which we consider to be just implicitly sustainable, like rewilding or something. So it's very vague, and I'm glad that Senator Higgins highlighted that. So yes, there's a lot of criticism of some of the carbon budgets that have been developed, even by the European Union, and even by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that actually do factor in a certain amount of negative emissions technologies. And while these technologies might ultimately come about, and they might play an important role, because we are in an emergency and we can't afford to turn down any solution that might work if it's sustainable. The problem is, and this is the thing that Kevin Anderson has been highlighting for years, is that we factor them into our budgeting and our scenarios, we lower the level of ambition that is required now. We make it look like we have a little bit of room to negotiate on the mitigation effort that's required. And in fact, we could be deluding ourselves, because we don't know for a fact that these technologies will be affordable or feasible or viable at scale. They are being developed in small scale projects, but not at scale. And the same is true, incidentally, of the land use fluxes that you would know more about yourself. We cannot be relying on putative sequestration projects from bogs that are already releasing emissions to suddenly be capturing emissions. The timescales involved are wildly different. It's very difficult to measure sequestration in land and soil, particularly in hedgerows. So we cannot be making up numbers based on faulty science or non-existent science.
We're getting to that. We'll move on to the political questions, if we may, and there's three in relation to tax. One addressed to Hildegarde specifically, which says, considering that the majority of global emissions are the responsibility of relatively few corporations, will corporate tax be increased to reflect the role that they can play in our carbon budget? And a second question regarding carbon tax, what are the provisions for climate justice? Who pays the tax? And finally, does the government really expect people to accept carbon taxes on ordinary people heating their homes? This is grossly unfair on people. Most of us do not currently have an alternative to fossil fuels, will do nothing to combat climate change, and will increase fuel poverty. Regressive policies like this damage the genuine climate movement. Climate action can and should improve people's lives, not increase suffering. So sorry about the difficulty of those questions, but we'll put them first to Hildegarde, if that's okay.
No, they're very good questions and they need to be tackled head on. And I think that was to the forefront of, I really go back to, I suppose, the Citizens' Assembly. What has led us to this bill? The Citizens' Assembly, that the engagement there, the cross-party Oireachtas committee, at the forefront of my mind was the Gilets Jaunes protests. And every decision that we made, and I think that was one thing we were all cross-party in agreement. We need to bring people with us, the just transition, and ensuring that this is fair as possible. I'm going to try and answer this really fast. So I'm going to try and cut to the chase. In relation to to carbon tax or putting a price on carbon, it is recognised by all the experts that it is absolutely critical that we send a clear message, but that we do it in a fair way. And that's where climate justice, the just transition comes into play. And I'm going to talk about what we're doing in relation to that. And that is why we as a cross-party committee agreed on that. There was one or two parties who were against it. And part of this was to ensure that we had a just transition that was done fairly. So there's already an agreement at a cross-party level that there is a trajectory out to 2030 in relation to putting a price on carbon, and it's moving in a gradual way to give people time to make that move. And that includes industry and corporations, and they will be paying that tax as well through if they're investing in fossil fuels. And that is why it's giving industry a very clear signal from Ireland's perspective that we are serious about reducing our emissions and that they need to start looking at renewable sources of energy. And lots of corporations now, businesses coming here, and customers are calling for industry to be greener and invest in renewable energy. Just in relation to what we were doing, the climate action plan states that by 2030 we will set our price on carbon at €100 per tonne. We projected that will be 9.5 billion over the next 10 years. It's basically ring fencing the extra carbon tax over the next 10 years, and 3 billion of that will go towards targeted social welfare payments to protect the most vulnerable, to protect against fuel poverty. 5 billion of that carbon tax will go towards retrofitting homes, starting in the Midlands. We have Bord na Móna, and looking at those who are on social welfare, social homes, starting there, the most vulnerable. And 1.5 billion of that will go towards farming practices. Again, encouraging farmers to make that transition, and has been outlined earlier that that is one of the sectors that is one of the big emitters. So we need to help farmers make that transition in a fair way. So it's not going to be easy. I'm not saying this is all sunny and rosy in the garden. You know, there's going to be difficult decisions, but we have put in place as fair a system as possible, and that's why the carbon tax will be ring fenced to ensure that we can have that just transition. I think I dealt with many. Who pays? Anyone who I suppose who invests in or spends on fossil fuels, and for those who can't afford it, on fuel allowance, for example, who are receiving social welfare payments, that you will be supported through that €3 billion targeted social welfare fund.
You're mute, Niall. Sorry.
Yeah.
Tim,
So
maybe
myself,
Alice Mary would like to comment as well.
Sure. And I'm also going to just say one sentence about the previous question to Sadhbh, because it's actually one of the crucial pieces that's being debated right now in terms of the bill. Is that question for zero carbon, or for net zero? What is and there's a very strong case, for example, to say that we shouldn't be including offsetting, given the concerns about double counting of accountancy tricks and so forth, as well as the pressure that it can place in terms of on developing countries. So the question of offsetting, whether or not that should be counted, is a key one. In terms of carbon capture technologies and the science, we've had experts, and we've had it both from kind of the most critical to the most optimistic experts, have all said you can only deal with the science that's actually in front of you. So it's going to be really crucial that no 5-year carbon budget is based on a hypothetical scenario of a science that we think might happen in the next 5 years. That's just I think that will be crucial to the success of the bill. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of that question of net zero, I think it's going to actually be one of the key questions about whether or not this legislation works, is that we make sure we don't give wishful thinking a space or a leverage. In terms of carbon, the cost of carbon. So for me, I believe carbon has a cost, and that the cost has been artificially deflated over very many years, and that the cost has largely been basically been felt and carried by the most vulnerable persons in the world. So for me, climate justice is a key factor in saying that I don't believe that we should continue to subsidize the fossil fuel industry by artificially deflating the price of carbon. So that is a key point for me. I don't see this as I don't like any of this language around lifestyle nudge or I don't think it is about individual encouragement or measures. For me, it is just a matter of, this is an industry that we've been heavily subsidizing, and I would prefer us to directly subsidize people rather than that industry. So that's where I believe that we need to look to. I would say the fund is fine, but it shouldn't be the limit. It shouldn't be simply that the money gathered, I think it was the 2 million or the 3 billion in targeted social welfare. That's part of it, but in fact we actually need to scale up, and that's where I think the just transition model from Scotland, which is a lot more ambitious than what we have at the moment. Just transition isn't mentioned in this bill. It needs to be, and the Scottish version doesn't simply talk about, you know, those who in a particular industry who've been hard hit and finding a way. It very much talks about how we plan delivering low carbon investment in infrastructure, massive investment, as I say, not just a small pool of money, but a large pool of money, directing massive investment into fair, high value work, into subsidizing the economic and social costs. So that's kind of, for me, crucial in terms of that question of and just the last thing, because it's important, with corporations, it's not simply enough that they pay on what they use, because we know that they have benefited in a way that most individual citizens haven't from the very large cost subsidization of carbon over years of fossil fuels. So one thing that I did try to bring in the NORA legislation when it was going through, and unsuccessfully, but I will try again, is I believe there needs to be a levy on major corporations and on major fossil fuel companies, so that they are in fact paying for the exit from fossil fuel. And we don't see what we've seen around the world, where ordinary citizens pick up the bill effectively for the dismantling of fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's, I think, that's a capital levy, not a consumer levy, but a capital levy on assets.
Great.
Thank you. Can we get another question there for Hildegarde before she has to go in 5 minutes?
Sure.
Hildegarde.
I have an excellent question for Hildegarde, actually. I've actually from more than one person, but basically Derek Hamilton has asked, how will building a carbon-heavy N6 ring road promote any future emissions reductions in Galway? And Micheál O'Conada basically also asks that question. And Sadhbh O'Neill basically has said she'd welcome the opportunity to say something about large road projects in general. But we'll give that to Hildegarde first, if that's okay.
Thank you. Well, as you know, the ring road is currently going through the planning process with An Bord Pleanála. But I just want to say in general that, you know, if you want to talk about Galway in general, or any city, you need to have both, like sustainable transport, an integrated public transport system. And I suppose from Galway's perspective, I would agree that it isn't good enough. We haven't moved fast enough. There's a Bus Connects programme that needs to be accelerated, rolled out. We need walking and cycling infrastructure, safer walking and cycling infrastructure. It's all part of it. And that's why through the programme for government, and in fact, initiative that will be under my remit, will be the Safe Routes to School initiative. And part of that will be coming out of a €360 million per year fund for walking and cycling infrastructure right across the country. And that will be driven by the local authorities. We have also committed to a 2-to-1 ratio split between new public transport to roads within this government. So there's a clear commitment to roll out greater projects in relation to public transport. But it's also important to say that public transport uses roads. Buses travel on roads, and we need to ensure that we maintain our road network to ensure that it's safe. The RSA, Road Safety Authority, comes under my remit, and we need to ensure that we continue to maintain and upgrade roads across the country. But to say that, you know, if you look at...
Will there be roads on, will there be buses on this road, the ring road? I mean, there's none on the Quincentenary Bridge.
I'm not going to get into the what I will say in relation to buses and the Galway transport strategy. Part of the Galway transport strategy is an integrated transport system within the city, and that part of that is Bus Connects. That is your bus system, as well as walking and cycling facilities. But there is a clear commitment, as I say, in government to a 2-to-1 ratio. And that trajectory, if you look at the National Development Plan as well, you can see that trajectory in relation to public transport to new roads projects. But it is important to look at the whole package within the National Development Plan, the Action Plan, the Climate Action Plan, and there is a huge focus now on walking, cycling, on electric vehicles as well, and ensuring that by 2030 we are looking at no more further combustion engines, no new combustion engines coming into the country. So I know the department is working on that as well. So it's a range of approaches from right across all the different sectors: transport, heating, homes, aviation is in my area as well. I think it was reference made to the haulage industry. We're looking at a new haulage strategy as well, and looking at technologies that have not yet come on board but are, I suppose, in the early stages. So it's an all of government and a cross-sectoral approach to reducing our emissions. I don't know.
Can I just ask?
Yeah, I think that was the question, was it?
Yeah. Yeah, Caroline, did you want
to put one? Yeah, I just wanted to follow up, especially with electrical vehicles, because there's a lot of issues in relation to the resources to create these electrical vehicles, you know, and that may affect developing countries and stuff like that as well.
We need to roll out a charging infrastructure as well across the country, and we're behind on that. And you can't expect people to buy an electric vehicle, you know, today. Not everyone can afford it. It's too costly at the moment. So by mid 2024, 2025, the cost of an electric vehicle should be about the same as a petrol or diesel vehicle. But in order for people to be able to invest in that and give them time, and that's why we have the climate action plan that's setting out that trajectory. We need to ensure that we roll out the proper charging infrastructure across the country.
I think Karen's question was more to do with environmental destruction, which comes about as a result of producing electric vehicles.
Yes, that's
rather than the infrastructure.
Well, if you look at the overall lifespan of an electric vehicle and the emissions that it would emit, it's my understanding from the experts that have been, I suppose, coming before our committee, the department, that the overall, if you want to reduce emissions in the transport sector, we need to look at the most used, I suppose, vehicle, which is the car that people use, and to try and get people to transition to electric vehicles. Public transport and buses, which we are decarbonising, of course, will be a critical part of that as well, but we have to make a concerted effort to transition from the combustion engine to electric vehicles. And look, if new technologies come on board over the next few years, and I know we can't just have the hope that it will, but there's huge research happening over the next few years, and we'll have to constantly change and adapt to those new technologies that will help us make that transition. But at the moment, it is the electric vehicle, and that is government policy.
I just might mention that emissions from aviation and shipping, I think, are going to be very key. At the moment, they kind of fall outside our accounting system at the moment, but that is another area of transport where emissions are very high.
Done at a European level as well in relation to aviation emissions. So look, there's lots to do. It's a very, I suppose, and just COVID as well has pointed a spotlight on all of our movements, from walking, cycling. We're all out walking, cycling more through level 5 lockdowns, and the importance of our walking and cycling infrastructure, I think there's a greater appreciation now for the rollout of that, and the investment and the funding is there from government. I could say the challenge will be the implementation and the rollout and getting the buy-in of communities to roll these projects out. But I think we're going in the right direction, and I think if there's there is a positive in COVID, I think the importance of that infrastructure is really to the fore at the moment.
Might come in there as well, just to say.
Yeah, could we let Hildegarde go, because it is 8:30.
Thank you so much.
It is 8:30 now, and we're joined by Pauline O'Reilly, Senator Pauline O'Reilly, as a government representative here as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a million,
Caroline, for asking me, and thank you everyone for all your questions. And sorry, I have to leave to do another Zoom meeting.
I might send you a list of all those questions we didn't get to ask you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
If I might, Niall, just come back in on the road projects point, and it touches on land use planning, and it touches on the way we measure the impacts of any kind of large scale piece of infrastructure, including gas infrastructure. Somebody put a very interesting question in there about Gas Networks Ireland, and I would lump them all together, because wherever we're building a piece of infrastructure that locks in demand for energy, resources, travel, commuting patterns, wherever, we are locking in patterns of consumption and production that are very difficult to get out of. So if you postpone building a road, you can argue about it for 10 years and emissions won't go up. But if you build a road and regret it 10 years later, there's very little you can do about it afterwards. The damage is done, the settlement patterns, the development patterns, come with the road. And I know that this has been litigated and tested and argued out in Galway, as it has all over the country. I grew up in Dublin, where all of these road projects that were being developed in Dublin City were hotly contested during the 80s and 90s. And many of these roads are now regretted and road widening projects in the city are really regretted. Projects like widening Parnell Street. If we were making that decision today, would we be demolishing houses on Parnell Street to make way for more traffic in the city centre? So we've got to think long term. So when you build infrastructure like roads, you're assuming that the costs of the road, and including environmental damage, are outweighed by the benefits. But we know that this is a very faulty and flawed way of analysing projects. It's very, 20th century. A lot of these projects are sitting on development plans for decades with a lot of inbuilt, sort of political support and buy-in, and people find it very hard to draw back and say, you know what, I think we need to step away from this project. So it's a bad way to go. We need a new development model, new patterns of mobility. We need to lower total energy demand. That's not just replacing vehicles with different technologies. It's about lowering travel demand and lowering energy demand. And we're actually already obliged to do this under the Energy Efficiency Directive. So our thinking is so narrow. We need to be so much more ambitious, and we need to get everybody car sharing, bicycle walking. EVs will be great for people in isolated places. I totally support that. But for many of us living in an urban environment, the car should not be what drives policy.
Okay, and Councillor Martina O'Connor has made a comment to back you up on that. She says we need to reduce the idea of the car rather than replace them all. So that seems to be a very popular view here. We're joined by Senator Pauline O'Reilly, and we have a question on data centres that she might be interested in addressing, which is, I'll read that out if that's okay. One of the fastest rising sources of carbon emissions in Ireland is from data centres. The Irish government has published a government strategy on the role of data centres in Ireland's enterprise strategy, with the objective to vastly increase the number of data centres in the country. A report from the Irish Academy of Engineering has estimated data centre expansion will require almost 9 billion in new energy infrastructure and add at least 1.5 million tonnes to Ireland's carbon emissions by 2030, up 13% spike on current electricity sector emissions. Does this strategy to attract data centres undermine the Climate Action Bill and compromise our ability to hit our emissions targets? And I've heard actually that it's projected currently that there will be roughly 4% of the world's carbon emissions will come from data centres by the year 2030, I think. So could we put that question to you, Pauline? Hello?
Hi, can you see me? Actually, no, let me just go see if I can go on video. Can you see me now? Actually, my connection is, I feel a little bit on the back foot here, coming in at the tail end of a conversation, and picking up Hildegarde's difficult questions. So I'll do that first.
You're well able for it now. You're well able for it.
I tell you, myself and Hildegarde I didn't know Hildegarde was actually taking part either. But other than I saw the advertisement. And just to say, so I'd just like to say a couple of points first on my own behalf, that I'm a member of the Climate Action Joint Oireachtas Committee, and there's 14 of us. Myself and Alice Mary are two of the members, and I'm representing the Green Party to an extent, except that we're all parties, so we try to work together and reach consensus. And certainly, while this is a major step forward, the Climate Action Bill, there are a lot of amendments that also need to be made, and I would echo an awful lot of what Sadhbh has said, and certainly have been in conversation with the Stop Climate Chaos. But we would have felt very similarly before even the Joint Oireachtas Committee started. We've had 18 hours now of testimony from experts, and it's been really useful in backing those points up, particularly around biodiversity, around strengthening the language from pursue to achieve, and around also leaving space there so that when new targets are set with our international obligations, that the bill will also take that into account. So I think all of those things and much more need to be taken into account. But it is a significant step forward all the same. And I just wanted, I had messaged Caroline there, I just want to come in briefly on the ring road there to say that as some of you will know, I mean, I have spoken against this at the oral hearing, against the ring road at the oral hearing. We are waiting to hear what decision will be made by An Bord Pleanála. But for my part, I don't think it's only about the fact that a road will, whether or not we have electric vehicles, it's also about the type of planning. And that's the significant point, that it's the type of planning and therefore the type of energy use of the new homes that would be built off the back of new significant infrastructure that needs to be taken into account. And oftentimes people talk about the fact that if we move to electric vehicles, we'll reduce our emissions. We don't reduce our emissions if we're also building homes at the far side of the ring road. In terms then of the data centres, it is something that I expect to come to us in the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action as well, and I certainly take on board all of the points raised in relation to it. For us in the Green Party, and for me, and I've said it in the Climate Action Joint Oireachtas Committee, this may be our only term in government for the foreseeable future. We need to ensure that while we're in government, we have the strongest possible action that we can, while also taking into account.
I think Pauline is frozen there, is she?
Pauline is frozen.
Okay.
Okay, we'll give her a couple of seconds.
Yeah.
Here she is.
Oh, you're back, you're back.
Did you hear me? Was I
we just lost
frozen
that
for a second there.
You're frozen again.
I just want to ask one question in regard to the local authorities. You know, we're part of the climate action monitoring groups, and really a lot of the time it's just presentations after presentations given to the group. And really what we need is a wider remit where the local authorities are linking in with the communities. And we're not really seeing that. We're not really seeing this widening approach, you know, that the local authorities are telling us how they'll cover the local swimming pool and that'll make it all better. But for engagement within the communities and for us to get the businesses on board, we need a wider remit for the local authorities. At the moment, I find it very, very narrow and very frustrating to actually get any good response from them. And any of my speakers, any of the speakers.
Yeah. Perhaps just by way of saying
I might come in then as well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
After
yes, indeed. The bill, as it stands, does create an obligation now on local authorities to do mitigation as well as adaptation plans. But as you'll know, if you're active at a local level in anything to do with the environment, we are literally drowning in deluges of plans and planning processes that require public consultation and engagement, where you feel just burdened by the responsibility of participation. And it's not an opportunity, it's a burden. So I think we need to think about public engagement and participation in a completely new way. We've had the experience of the Citizens' Assembly, where you take people who are not involved in anything, you kind of tool them up over a couple of days with some presentations and lots of opportunities for questions and discussion, and they come up with the wisest, most amazing recommendations that have really high levels of consensus. So this deliberative approach to public engagement has produced more ambition than was expected, whether you're talking about repeal or climate or anything else. They always come up with more ambition than was expected and than the political system is coming up with. And we should trust people. We should give communities the resources to do that kind of public engagement at a local level and give them the real power to monitor the implementation of those kinds of recommendations. So other countries have done citizens' assemblies in really innovative ways. Belgium has some very interesting things going on. And our experience is valuable too. But we've had a climate dialogue process that got going and then just wound up after 18 months with, obviously COVID got in the way as well, with no prospect of it being continued and rolled out at a community level. So I think the point, your question Caroline, points to what I perceive as a local activist, as a kind of a deep-rooted structural problem with engaging communities in local decision-making. And we keep setting up new structures, we keep designing plans and consultation processes, but we won't give them any power. And that's a problem. And even the elected representatives at a local level have very little power.
If I could just come in on it. So there's two things there. There's the question around local authorities, and then there's that wider question around public consultation. And I would say, first of all, in terms of local authorities, there are new responsibilities for local authorities in this legislation. There's also this commitment that the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to be reflected in local area plans. But we are at a crucial moment, and I would say it is important that people do engage, and that they engage in consultations, and that they really steer the next. We know that most places around the country are going to have local area development plans, or our city development plans are all going to be developed around the next basically 12 to 18 months in most parts of the country. And it's really crucial that the most ambitious version of the environmental responsibility and the most ambitious version in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals is embedded into that. And then there is a battle at national level, which I think we need to support. I'm on the Finance Committee. One thing I'd like is to give more financial power actually to local authorities, and that's something in a separate realm. But I think there needs to be more power given to local authority level, including to citizens at local authority level, to enact that. But the local authority level piece is going to be crucial, and we've seen it across the world, that cities are ahead of their countries in many cases in terms of the level of ambition. Dublin City has a higher level of carbon reduction ambition than the country does currently. You know, so there's both a responsibility and there's a possibility to drive the change. On that though, on public consultation, the bill is weak. And it's really, that is a crucial issue, because in the previous bill, it specifically stated that a minister, for example, when they're doing up a plan, shall publish a notice in the internet and in more than one newspaper, inviting members of the public and interested parties to make submissions. At the moment, it literally just says that a minister may consult with members of the public as he or she considers appropriate. So this is a huge problem in the bill. There is an absolute gap of commitment to public consultation. And that's important, not just because it's important, but because in terms of if the bill is going to be compatible with the Aarhus Convention, which is around citizens having a say in environmental decision-making, it's going to be really important that public consultation is stronger. And part of that Aarhus Convention and part of that spirit of public accountability is also that the bill should be properly judiciable. And that's why we need strong primary legislation that uses clear language where people can see clearly what is being committed to. And if it is not achieved, then as well as us politically, you know, giving out in whatever committee, that citizens and members of the public, like in Climate Case Ireland and others, will be able to take cases and demand action. So that's part of a system of accountability as well. And it's really important. There is a concern that certain places where the bill seems to have been weakened seem to be trying to weaken it so that it would be less judiciable, but it will still lead to litigation. That's what we've heard from all the experts. It's just that it'll be messier litigation. And I think it needs to be, that clarity of language is part of the duty to public accountability as well.
Okay, thank you.
Caroline, Martina O'Connor, could I come in briefly on this as Pauline is not available?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I think there is a strong sense, I have to say, still quite a hierarchical sort of an approach to you know, participation in Ireland, you know, and we really, that's part of what we need to fight, you know, to some extent. And there's this sort of, you know, you have your hierarchical considered on one side, and on the other side, then no matter what they do it wrong, you know, kind of an approach. And we've got almost locked in, and I almost think the internet in some ways has made that sort of an approach, you know, it has increased the space to continue with that approach. And we just have to shift, you know, and I think, you know, some of the models that have been useful elsewhere need to be looked at, like in the next 6 months, in order to move ourselves forward really constructively. And also, you know, if we don't do this, if we fail to sort of bring the public, you know, or act on what the public wants rather than bring them along, the changes that have to take place in order to bring this, you know, the carbon emissions down, you know, I know it's not up to the individuals to do it, but they do have to live differently. They might have to queue for the bus, or they might have to queue for the train instead of, you know, jumping in their car outside their door. Things like that. They might have to not fly as often or whatever. And those changes can't take place unless, you know, they come up with the ideas rather than us telling them this is the best thing to do. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Martina.
If I may, Caroline, we have a number of questions which I group. In fact, they're coming thick and fast now at this stage.
Yeah, and we've got about 12 minutes left. Okay.
So if people could be very quick with their answers, try to do it in 1 minute, not in 5. Okay. So very quickly, just I'll group these ones. Turf cutting, under turf cutting, wind energy. Reports have shown that onshore wind turbines on areas of upland peat can release more carbon emissions than they save. So that's 1 point. Then we saw that the programme for government backloading the commitments on the climate energy with this bill, that it talks of carbon neutrality by 2050. With banning turf cutting, that's dragged on since the 1990s, and indeed Greta Thunberg said it today, but it seems like politicians are happy to sign up to targets that don't require immediate action. This bill seems to be more of the same. How will the bill change that sort of behaviour? So then a question from Sinead Jackson. May I ask Sadhbh, I was speaking to the project manager with Gasworks Network Ireland, and I think Sadhbh already referred to this, and they said that they hadn't even heard of the Just Transition. I know that ESB and Board and Mona are switching over. Why are some companies complying and others still ignoring the policies that have been agreed? And then finally on this section, just one more question regarding farming. After REPS and GLOS, I haven't been able to get information about the new scheme for 2020 onwards. Will there be a more ambitious environmental oriented scheme which allows farmers to rewild land and or to use it for carbon sequestration? So that's it. Comments on land use in general, but specifically addressing those. Okay, so will we put that to Sadhbh first, as she was actually mentioned?
Yeah, could I mention, just can I respond quickly to the backloading question? This relates to getting the language in the bill right. If we can get the language in the bill right, backloading won't be possible. And the other thing, and Alice Mary touched on it earlier, and it's very important, is to draw from some of the experience in Scotland and the UK for corrective action. So it's not just enough to say, oops, I missed the target, sorry about that, and handing your successor over a poisoned chalice. There needs to be corrective action, and that needs to be built into the legislation. So there will be some delay in implementing climate mitigation. It can be slow to, see the effects of certain policies over time. So that's why a 5-year period is generally a good idea. But I wouldn't interpret that as backloading. That's just a necessary, envelope of flexibility. You have some winters where we use more heating fuel than others and that kind of thing. And back to the land use. So to the best of my knowledge, there's been a lot of disturbing news about the new CAP and the way that's being progressed through the European Parliament in a much weaker form than even the Commission was recommending. To the best of my knowledge, the scheme that will result from that is not finalised yet, but it's absolutely essential that we reward farmers for sound farming practices that generate, rural livelihoods and incomes, that support farmers to stay on the land and support them to work with nature, so we get nature-based solutions. So this is the kind of language that, in fact, Professor Yvonne Buckley was recommending be inserted into the bill. She was one of the experts who gave testimony, and she had many, many suggestions for how we could lock in nature-based solutions right throughout the legislation to make sure that land use practices to sequester carbon are done in the right way.
Thank you.
Okay. Maybe Alice Mary would like to comment on land use.
Yeah. Well, again, I would say Professor Yvonne Buckley was very, very strong on this. The question of, we actually had the specific example of, wind farms, and can you assume that they are, and the question was, no, it is a matter of environmental impact assessment, looking to the fact that if they're on peatland, it may cause more damage. than it is. We know that in terms of forestry, we've seen that a lot of forestry that's happened. The reports now show that, you know, in that monoculture forestry, a lot of it is producing more emissions than it's in fact sequestering. So it is around having the environmental impact assessment tools properly applied so that you're really looking at the biodiversity and the environmental impact in the round, rather than something with a green label on it being assumed to automatically be delivering in terms of emissions reduction and in terms of climate change. It is more joined up approach. In terms of the peatland and the turfs, we are well overdue having a properly expanding and reaching the target. We know we're under pressure and from Europe because we don't have enough special areas of conservation, and indeed there's concern that those special areas of conservation and those natural heritage areas, the NHAs, have not been properly kept to a standard. They've been allowed to degrade. They've been allowed to be cut to a large degree. I think the turbary rights are important there is the cultural case around turbary rights, but that is not the same as allowing the kind of scale of peat cutting which we have been having continuously and which has continued. And we need to look at restoration where that's possible, but even where restoration is not possible, we need to be looking at re-wetting. And I think we definitely, and this relates to the wildlife bill. And there's, you know, I would have had very extensive debate on the wildlife bill around ensuring that every part of our peatland, we really look to how we can bring it back into service in terms of the environment, because we do have 8% of the world's current peatland. In terms of the rewilding was mentioned, so there's rewilding, there's re-wetting, there's restoration. In terms of, sorry, you had mentioned another piece in terms of land use. I think we also need to look at things like mining, and that's going to be important in terms of land use strategy, because we know that heavy minerals, for example, have a huge toll in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of biodiversity, and a knock-on effect in terms of climate and emissions. So I think there's a lot of land use issues that need to be addressed, and we need to ensure that every acre is being properly used as best it can. Can I just ask, what was the second part of the question? Sorry, Niall, because I was...
Yeah, no problem
I'll
at all.
come in again.
Yeah,
I think Pauline is there, not Neil as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was
sorry,
but I was just...
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Alice Mary, sorry.
Come in afterwards.
I was just off video there to preserve my internet. Look, there's an awful lot of questions there, but fundamentally, and Alice Mary mentioned turbary rights there. I mean, certainly we're not against turbary rights at all. It's more the large scale peat, I suppose, that we're really talking about now. As part of the July stimulus, actually, we announced that 2,100 hectares in the West Coast would be brought onto this Atlantic Bog project. And just a couple of days ago, I've got clarification there that one of the 4 areas will be Derryclare in Connemara, and that'll be restoration, re-wetting of bogland there. And we have to remember that 20% of Ireland is actually, you know, bog. So that's a key part of both our carbon sinks, but also our biodiversity. So it's absolutely key that we deal with it. But it is also key that we look at our biodiversity in terms of farmers as the custodians of that land. And therefore, that's what CAP is so important. It's so important when we're looking at farmers as custodians, that CAP is brought into that. And I know that REPS is something that people have found has really helped in the past. And look, I mean, there is a way to go there from a European perspective on what will be done around CAP, but we need to use every MEP that we have in order to ensure that Ireland has the best deal. And when I say the best deal, traditionally that would have meant Ireland can get out of its obligations, but what we now mean is that Ireland will fulfil its obligations by ensuring that the workers, the farmers, are paid for the work as custodians of the land. It's hugely important, particularly for us here in Galway, and that's what farmers talk about. You know, no, you can't make a living from selling from selling the produce on your land to the same extent that you could. But what you can do is say, you have actually managed to help us to reach our targets. You have actually managed to help to preserve nature, and therefore you deserve to be paid for that. And look, like, there are an awful lot more questions there, Niall, and I can't even remember half them, but I think that that's the critical point that I wanted to get across.
And just on
conscious.
CAP, I just wanted to say, okay, because I do think
I'm conscious we've 3 minutes left in our discussion.
I did want to acknowledge that MEP Grace O'Sullivan has been very strong on that in the European Parliament, but that we need the Irish government to also be strong when this debate moves to council level, because it's also going to be at the European Council, and to make sure that kind of custodianship and the valuing of effectively small farmers in that custodian role is balanced off and made more central than, for example, large farming, which might have a slightly different agenda.
Okay, thanks. Sadhbh, 1 minute there for a little.
Okay.
Anything you want to put forward?
I just want to say very quickly that our bogs, whether they're tiny pockets of blanket bog or a raised bog, whatever, or large patches of what look like denuded landscape, this is our rainforest. We are talking about locked carbon. It's our fossil carbon, if you like, in the turf. If we take it out, we burn it, release it, and the emissions stay in the atmosphere for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So any benefit we get in the short term, no matter how you conceive it, cultural, economic, anything else, is short term. The impact is long term and irreversible for the most part. So now I'm not from Galway. I don't own any land apart from my little house in Kilkenny, and I'm not connected to the rural economy in the same way. So I feel free to speak on this. I would ask the politicians and even environmentalists to be far more robust in challenging the idea that just because it's something we used to do, it's something we need to continue to do. Absolutely, the destruction caused by harvesting or mining of peat for horticultural purposes and by Bord na Móna over decades did most of the damage. But we need to start respecting nature wherever it is. We need to look in our own backyards and acknowledge the importance of bog for biodiversity, for bird species, particularly that require that particular kind of wet, boggy habitat to survive at all. We're losing so many species of bird, and we declare emergencies, but this is climate action. This is biodiversity action. It's when we pull back and we say, enough, we're not going to do it anymore. So as an urban person, it's easy for me to say that, I know. But
no, I think the leave it in the ground is a way that people and many new generations are saying that's what they would like to do. So that, you know, the generations who would inherit turbary rights are saying the best way you can serve us is by leaving it in the ground. So that is around that relationship as well.
yeah.
You know?
Thank you.
Okay, can I just ask Caroline, do we have time for one more round of questions, or we're just about bang on time now?
I think we don't. I think Anne is shaking her head there saying no. I think there's so many questions that need to be answered. So we've recorded it. We should be able to see the questions in the chat. So if any of our speakers want to come back and answer those questions, if they get a chance to look at it again later on, you know, when we put it up online or whatever, we'll send
if we
you
could
the
just
link.
acknowledge the questions everybody everybody else. Brendan Mulligan, Derek Hambleton, Sinead Jackson, we've Vincent Carraher, Ashley Callahan has asked a question, Emma Court, Terry McDonough has made some comments, Jesse, just to acknowledge Micheál O'Cinnéide, Martina O'Connor, you know, to acknowledge the huge participation from the audience there as well. And I think we could go on for another couple of hours, judging by the enthusiasm here, Caroline, but I think most of us do have homes to go to.
Yeah, and
in fact, most of us are in them.
Yeah, thank you very much to our speakers and for taking the time out. It was fantastic. And thanks, Pauline. I know you didn't get much time, but we can only have 3 speakers. We thought that was enough, you know, to try. And as we can see, we didn't even have enough time to get through all the many issues that environmental and biodiversity brings up. And there's the poll there from Anne. Do you see it?
How would you rate your understanding
of the climate bill? So if you could all take that poll before you leave.
Okay. And just a point I must make to Sadhbh is that in fact peatlands hold 4 times as much carbon, stored 4 times as much carbon as rainforests. So, I mean, really, they are the #1 ecosystem in terms of carbon storage on the planet. And we're so lucky to have about 20% of our country covered by peatlands. So, you know, it's a huge, we can do a lot. And there we go. The #1 answer is good enough.
Yeah, 53%, which is good. At least there's nobody answered no understanding at all, which has probably come a long way in Ireland, really. Because that probably could have been an answer a few years back. So thank you very much. If you'd like to, yes, yeah. If anyone would like to join the Galway Environmental Network and get involved with more, you know, we try to have more events and that. You can join us at the Galway Environmental Network at gmail.com, or you can join us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter. And what else? Oh yes, Galway Climaton is on Wednesday. I was told to mention that at the end of this. You can find out more information, I think, on Twitter, and I'll try and share something on our Facebook. And anything else, Niall?
And we have another such event in December, just to mention that as well, Caroline. Where our next meeting is in the first week in December, just before we kick into the Christmas. So I'd really say thanks for some excellent speakers tonight. I mean, judging by the comments, absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
And great engagement from the public. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well done to you, Caroline.
And you.